What I walked in on last Tuesday night was so shocking that I still can't sleep in my own bed. My roommate and her boyfriend weren't just crossing boundaries. They were living a secret life in my most private space that makes my skin crawl every time I think about it. Everyone thinks I'm overreacting to a simple mistake, but what I found hidden in my room afterward will make you understand why I can never trust either of them again. I, 24F, have been living with my roommate Sarah, 22F, for 8 months in a 2-bedroom apartment. When we first moved in together, we agreed on basic house rules. No overnight guests more than twice a week, always give 24-hour notice before having people over, and absolutely never go into each other's private bedrooms without permission. Sarah seemed responsible and respectful, and for the first few months, everything was perfect. Sarah's boyfriend Jake, 25M, has been staying over regularly for about 3 months now. At first, he was polite and followed our agreed-upon rules. He would only come over on weekends, helped with groceries sometimes, and always asked if I was comfortable before making himself at home in our shared living spaces. I actually liked him initially and thought Sarah had found a good guy who respected boundaries. But something changed about 6 weeks ago that should have been my first warning sign. I started noticing that items in our apartment were being moved around when I wasn't home. Small things at first: my coffee mug in a different cabinet, my throw blanket folded differently on the couch, my books rearranged on the shelf. When I mentioned it to Sarah, she laughed it off and said Jake might have been cleaning up while she was in the shower. The overnight stays also started happening more frequently without the required notice. I would come home from work to find Jake's shoes by the door and his overnight bag in the living room, with no text or warning from Sarah. When I brought this up, Sarah apologized and said they had been spontaneous about his visits because their relationship was getting more serious, and they wanted to spend more time together. I tried to be understanding because I remember how exciting new relationships can be. But I also started feeling like I was living with 2 roommates instead of 1, since Jake was essentially there every night. He was using our shared bathroom constantly, eating food I had bought for myself, and leaving his personal items scattered around the common areas like he lived there permanently. The situation escalated when I came home early from a business trip last month and found Jake in our kitchen at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, making lunch and watching TV in his underwear. Sarah was at work, which meant Jake had been alone in our apartment for hours without her there. When I asked him about it, he casually said Sarah had given him a key so he could come over whenever he wanted, even when she wasn't home. I was furious that Sarah had made this decision without consulting me. Giving someone a key to our shared space was a major decision that affected both of us, especially since Jake wasn't on the lease and hadn't been background checked by our landlord. When I confronted Sarah that evening, she acted like I was being unreasonable and said that couples naturally progress to sharing keys and space. But here's what I didn't know at the time, and what makes everything that happened next so much worse. Jake had actually been coming to our apartment during the day while both Sarah and I were at work. Our elderly neighbor Mrs. Chun later told me she had seen him entering and leaving multiple times per week for over a month, always during work hours when he thought no one would notice his presence. The boundary violations kept escalating in ways that made me increasingly uncomfortable. I would find my personal items moved around more frequently, and I started noticing that some of my food was disappearing faster than I could eat it. My expensive face wash and moisturizer were running low much quicker than usual, and I suspected Jake was using my personal care products without asking permission. I also started finding Jake's belongings in places they shouldn't be. His razor in my bathroom drawer, his socks in my clean laundry basket, his phone charger plugged in beside my bed. When I asked Sarah about these things, she would always have an excuse. He must have gotten confused about which bathroom was which, or the laundry baskets must have gotten mixed up, or maybe he had borrowed my outlet when his wasn't working. The final warning sign that I completely ignored was when I found my bedroom door unlocked, when I was sure I had locked it before leaving for work. I have a simple latch lock on my bedroom door because I value my privacy and want to keep my personal space separate from the shared areas of the apartment. Finding it unlocked made me paranoid, but Sarah convinced me I must have forgotten to lock it in my morning rush. What happened last Tuesday night started innocuously enough. I had gone out for dinner with coworkers and wasn't planning to be home until around 10 p.m. I texted Sarah around 8 p.m. to let her know I was leaving the restaurant, giving her advance notice that I would be home soon. She responded with, "Okay, see you later," and nothing seemed unusual about our exchange. When I got home at 9:45 p.m., the living room lights were off and the apartment seemed quiet. I assumed Sarah and Jake were watching a movie in her bedroom or had gone to sleep early. I went to the kitchen to get some water and noticed there were wine glasses and empty takeout containers on the counter, suggesting they had been having a romantic evening together. I grabbed my water and headed toward my bedroom, looking forward to changing into comfortable clothes and winding down from a long day at work. But as I approached my bedroom door, I could hear sounds coming from inside my room that made my blood run cold. There were voices, movement, and other noises that clearly indicated someone was in my most private space. My first thought was that we were being robbed and that intruders had broken into my bedroom while Sarah and Jake were in her room. I quietly approached my door and listened more carefully, preparing to call the police if I confirmed there were strangers in my apartment. But as I got closer, I realized the voices I was hearing were familiar. They belonged to Sarah and Jake. I stood outside my own bedroom door for several minutes, trying to process what I was hearing and what it might mean. The sounds were unmistakably intimate, and it became clear that Sarah and Jake were having sex in my bed, in my private space, surrounded by all of my personal belongings. I felt violated and disgusted, but I also couldn't believe they would cross such an obvious boundary. When I finally worked up the courage to knock on my own bedroom door, everything went silent immediately. I called out, "Sarah, what are you doing in my room?" and waited for what felt like an eternity for a response. Finally, Sarah's voice came through the door saying, "Oh God, we thought you wouldn't be home until later. Can you give us 5 minutes?" The casualness of her response made me realize that this wasn't a mistake or a moment of poor judgment. Sarah was asking for time to finish whatever they were doing and clean up, as if using my bedroom for their intimate activities was a minor inconvenience rather than a massive violation of my privacy and boundaries. The entitlement in her voice made me angrier than I had ever been. I told them they had 2 minutes to get out of my room, and that I would be waiting in the living room to discuss this situation. I was shaking with anger and disbelief as I paced around our shared space, trying to understand how two people I trusted could betray my boundaries so completely. The violation felt deeply personal, like they had invaded the most private part of my life. When Sarah and Jake finally emerged from my bedroom, they both looked embarrassed but not nearly as mortified as I expected. Sarah was wearing my bathrobe, which added another layer of violation to the situation. Jake wouldn't make eye contact with me, but Sarah immediately went into explanation mode, trying to minimize what had happened and make it seem like a simple misunderstanding. Sarah's explanation was that her bedroom was too messy for a romantic evening, and that they thought I wouldn't mind if they borrowed my space since I wasn't supposed to be home until later. She said they were planning to wash my sheets and clean up any mess before I returned, as if that would somehow make using my bed for their sexual activities acceptable behavior. But here's where the story takes a much darker turn that nobody knows about yet. While Sarah was giving me her explanation, I noticed that my bedroom door was propped open, and I could see inside my room. What I saw made me realize this wasn't the first time they had used my space without permission, and it certainly wasn't just about having a clean room for romance. My bedside table drawer was open, and I could see that my personal items inside had been moved around. My journal was sitting on top of my dresser instead of in its usual hiding spot. My laptop was open on my desk, even though I always close it and put it away before leaving home. Most disturbing of all, there were 2 wine glasses on my nightstand with lipstick marks on both, suggesting they had been making themselves comfortable in my space for quite some time. The evidence suggested that Sarah and Jake hadn't just impulsively used my room for a quick romantic encounter. They had been treating my bedroom like their personal love nest, drinking wine, going through my belongings, and potentially accessing my personal computer and private thoughts. The violation was so much deeper than just using my bed. They had been living out fantasies in my most private space. I asked Sarah and Jake to leave the apartment immediately, so I could process what had happened and figure out how to handle the situation. Sarah protested that it was her apartment too, and that she had nowhere else to go so late at night. Jake offered to leave but said Sarah should be allowed to stay since she lived there. I told them both that I needed space and time to think, and that Jake was no longer welcome in our apartment indefinitely. After they left, I began investigating my room more thoroughly to understand the full scope of what they had been doing in my space. What I found was so disturbing that I considered calling the police, moving out immediately, or both. The violations were far more extensive than just one night of inappropriate space usage. My computer's browser history showed that Jake had been using my laptop regularly while I was at work, accessing his social media accounts, watching videos, and even checking his bank account on my personal device. The history went back weeks, confirming that he had been treating my bedroom like his personal office during his unauthorized daytime visits to our apartment. Even worse, I found evidence that they had been taking photos in my bedroom. My digital camera, which I keep on my dresser, had new photos on it that I hadn't taken. The photos showed Sarah and Jake posing intimately on my bed, wearing my clothes, and even using my personal items as props for their romantic pictures. They had been creating memories and documenting their relationship in my most private space. The most disturbing discovery was in my journal. Sarah had clearly been reading it regularly, because I found notes in her handwriting responding to entries I had written about my personal life, my dating experiences, and even my thoughts about their relationship. She had been treating my private thoughts like a public diary, and inserting herself into my most personal reflections. I also found evidence that they had been going through my closet and dresser drawers. Several of my clothing items were missing, and others had been moved to different locations. My expensive lingerie collection had clearly been handled and possibly worn by Sarah, which felt like an incredibly intimate violation. They had been playing dress-up in my personal belongings like children in a costume box. The financial violations were significant too. My spare credit card, which I keep in my bedroom for emergencies, had been used for several small purchases over the past month. Food delivery, streaming service subscriptions, and even gas purchases had been charged to my card without my knowledge or permission. Jake had apparently been treating my emergency credit as his personal expense account. When I confronted Sarah with this evidence the next day, her reaction confirmed that the bedroom incident was just the tip of the iceberg. Instead of being horrified by the extent of their violations, she became defensive and angry that I had invaded their privacy by going through my own belongings and checking my own computer history. Sarah's response revealed that she felt entitled to use my space and possessions because we were roommates, and she considered Jake part of our household. She said I was being possessive and unreasonable about material things, and that she had always planned to tell me about borrowing my clothes and using my computer eventually. Her complete lack of understanding about privacy and boundaries was shocking. The situation escalated when Jake showed up at our apartment the next evening, demanding to discuss the situation and convince me to let him continue staying over. He claimed that I was being jealous and vindictive because I was single and couldn't handle seeing Sarah happy in a relationship. His accusation was so far from reality that it showed how completely he misunderstood the nature of his violations. Jake also admitted that he had been coming to our apartment during work hours for weeks, but he framed it as doing favor for Sarah by handling deliveries and maintenance issues. He said Sarah had asked him to be there during the day to help with apartment management, which was news to me since I hadn't been informed that we needed apartment management assistance or that Jake had been appointed to provide it. But here's where Jake's story fell apart completely. I contacted our landlord to ask about any maintenance visits or delivery issues that might have required someone to be in our apartment during work hours. Our landlord confirmed that there had been no maintenance requests, no delivery problems, and no reason for anyone to have access to our apartment during the day. Jake had been lying about his reasons for being there. The landlord also informed me that having an unofficial resident who wasn't on the lease was a violation of our rental agreement. Jake's daily presence and his key access meant that he was essentially living there without being approved or background checked by the property management company. Sarah and I could face eviction if Jake continued staying over regularly without being added to the lease officially. This news gave me legal leverage to enforce my boundary about Jake no longer being welcome in our apartment. But it also revealed that Sarah had been putting both of our housing situations at risk by allowing Jake to treat our apartment like his second home, without considering the legal implications of his constant presence. When I presented this information to Sarah, she finally began to understand the seriousness of what had been happening. But instead of apologizing and working to repair the damage, she announced that she and Jake had decided to move in together officially, and that she would be breaking our lease to find a place where Jake could live legally. Sarah's decision to choose Jake over our roommate relationship was her right, but the way she handled it showed that she still didn't understand or care about the violations that had led to this point. She treated the situation like a normal relationship progression, rather than the result of months of boundary violations, privacy invasions, and financial theft. The apartment search process revealed even more disturbing information about Sarah and Jake's relationship with boundaries and honesty. When potential landlords called me as a reference for Sarah, they asked questions about her living habits that suggested she and Jake had been lying on their apartment applications about their current living situation and their reasons for moving. Sarah had apparently been telling potential landlords that she was currently living alone and that Jake had never stayed at our apartment, which was obviously false. She was also claiming that they needed to move because I was an unstable roommate who had been harassing her boyfriend, which was a complete fabrication designed to make her look like a victim rather than the person who had violated boundaries. The lies Sarah was telling about our situation made me realize that she had never intended to take responsibility for what she and Jake had done. Instead of acknowledging their violations and working to make amends, they were rewriting history to make themselves look like the victims of an unreasonable roommate who couldn't handle their relationship. Meanwhile, I was dealing with the aftermath of having my most private space violated in multiple ways. I had to change all my passwords, cancel and reorder my credit card, and even consider whether I needed to file a police report for the unauthorized use of my computer and financial accounts. The practical consequences of their violations were extensive and time-consuming to resolve. The emotional impact was even worse than the practical problems. I felt violated and unsafe in my own home, unable to trust that my belongings and private spaces would remain private. I installed a better lock on my bedroom door, but the knowledge that people I trusted had been secretly living parts of their lives in my most personal space continued to affect my ability to relax and feel secure at home. I also had to deal with the financial cost of replacing items that had been used, damaged, or stolen. My bedding obviously had to be completely replaced, but so did personal care products, some clothing items, and even some electronics that had been damaged by unauthorized use. The total cost was over $800, which Sarah refused to reimburse when I presented her with receipts. The discovery process continued to reveal new violations even after Sarah and Jake moved out. I found that they had been giving out our apartment's address as Jake's official address for various purposes, including getting mail delivered there and using it on job applications. Our mailbox had been receiving bills and official documents for Jake for weeks without my knowledge. They had also apparently been using our apartment for social purposes beyond just their romantic relationship. I found evidence that Jake had been inviting other people over during the day while Sarah and I were at work, including friends who had left behind personal items and food containers. Our apartment had become a hangout spot for Jake and his friends without either Sarah or me being aware of it. The most disturbing revelation came from Mrs. Chun, our elderly neighbor, who approached me after Sarah and Jake moved out. She told me that she had been concerned for weeks about the number of different people she had seen coming and going from our apartment during work hours, including some individuals who appeared to be conducting business transactions in our building's hallway. Mrs. Chin's description suggested that Jake might have been using our apartment for purposes that went beyond just having a key for convenience. The regular daytime visitors and apparent business activities raised questions about whether Jake had been engaging in illegal or inappropriate activities in our home while Sarah and I were unaware of his presence. When I confronted Sarah with this information during our final conversation before she moved out, she admitted that Jake had been having friends over during the day but claimed she had given him permission. However, she also seemed shocked by some of the details Mrs. Chun had shared, suggesting that even Sarah hadn't been fully aware of how Jake was using our apartment when he had access to it. Sarah's partial ignorance about Jake's activities made me realize that he had been deceiving both of us about the extent of his unauthorized apartment usage. While Sarah was guilty of enabling and participating in boundary violations, Jake had been conducting a separate level of violations that went beyond even what Sarah had approved or known about. The final twist in this situation came when Jake contacted me directly after they had moved out, asking if I would be willing to lie to their new landlord about the circumstances of their departure from our apartment. He wanted me to confirm their story that they had been model tenants who left only because of personality conflicts with their roommate, not because of boundary violations and potential lease violations. Jake's request confirmed that they still didn't understand or accept the seriousness of what they had done. Even after moving out and supposedly starting fresh, they wanted me to participate in covering up their violations so they could continue avoiding responsibility for their actions. His entitlement was breathtaking in its scope and persistence. I refused to lie for them and instead told Jake that if any landlords contacted me, I would be honest about my experiences with both of them as tenants and house guests. This meant describing the privacy violations, the unauthorized apartment access, the financial theft, and the potential subletting violations that had put our original lease at risk. Jake's response to my refusal was to threaten legal action against me for defamation and interference with housing opportunities. He claimed that telling the truth about their violations would be illegal harassment, and that he would sue me if I prevented them from finding a new apartment. His threats were legally baseless but emotionally intimidating. The irony of Jake threatening me with legal action, while he had committed multiple actual violations of my privacy, property, and possibly law, was not lost on me. But his threats also made me realize that he was prepared to continue victimizing me even after moving out, which reinforced my decision to maintain strict boundaries about his presence in my life. Sarah's response to learning about Jake's threats against me was revealing. Instead of being appalled that her boyfriend was trying to intimidate and silence me, she asked if I would consider reaching some kind of compromise that would allow Jake to avoid negative references. Her continued prioritization of Jake's interests over basic decency showed that she had learned nothing from our experience. The situation finally reached resolution when Sarah and Jake found an apartment through a private landlord who didn't require references from previous roommates or landlords. This meant they could avoid accountability for their violations, while I could avoid further harassment about changing my story or lying about their behavior. But the long-term impact on my life has been significant. I now live alone because I don't trust my ability to identify roommates who will respect boundaries and privacy. The experience taught me that people can seem trustworthy while simultaneously engaging in extensive violations of the most basic living agreements and personal boundaries. I've also become much more security conscious about my personal belongings and private spaces. I now have multiple locks on my bedroom door, password protection on all my devices, and I regularly check my financial accounts for unauthorized usage. The violations I experienced have made me hypervigilant about protecting my privacy in ways that I never needed to consider before. The emotional recovery has been ongoing. Learning that people I trusted had been secretly living parts of their lives in my most private space, going through my personal thoughts, and stealing from me financially created a sense of violation that goes beyond simple roommate conflicts. It's affected my ability to trust people with access to my living space and personal belongings. Looking back on this situation, I still can't believe how extensively Sarah and Jake violated basic boundaries, and how little remorse they showed when confronted with evidence of their actions. What started as a simple roommate situation became a complex web of privacy violations, financial theft, unauthorized access, and potential illegal activity. The support I've received from friends and family has been mixed. Some people understand that what happened was serious and unacceptable. Others think I should have been more flexible and understanding about young couples needing space to develop their relationship. The minimization of my experience by some people has been almost as frustrating as the original violations. But I've also learned valuable lessons about recognizing red flags in living situations and the importance of enforcing boundaries early before violations escalate. The small signs I ignored in the beginning, items being moved, overnight guests without notice, personal products disappearing, were indicators of a much larger problem with respect for boundaries and honesty. So Reddit, AITA for not letting my roommate's boyfriend stay over anymore after I caught them using my bedroom? Was I being unreasonable about wanting my private space to remain private? Or was I right to enforce strict boundaries after discovering the extent of their violations? Should I have been more understanding about young couples needing space? Or did Sarah and Jake cross lines that made continued cohabitation impossible? I sometimes wonder if I handled the situation in the best possible way, but I also know that the violations went far beyond one night of poor judgment. The extensive evidence of ongoing privacy violations, financial theft, and unauthorized apartment access made it impossible for me to trust either of them with access to my home and belongings. I just learned that Sarah and Jake's new landlord contacted my old landlord asking questions about property damage and lease violations. Apparently, they're already having problems in their new apartment after only 2 months. Some people never learn from their mistakes. Jake just sent me a friend request on social media with a message saying he wants to clear the air and explain his side of the story. After everything that happened, the fact that he thinks I want to hear his justification shows he still doesn't understand what he did wrong. I blocked him immediately. Mrs. Chun told me yesterday that she's seen Jake lurking around our building several times in the past month. Always during work hours when he would know I'm not home. I've reported this to both my landlord and the police, and I'm considering getting a restraining order if he continues showing up at my home. This situation apparently isn't over even though they moved out months ago.